Welcome everybody to our next episode of Car Rides with Clergy. Today we are having a special episode because we are here indoors where it's nice and cool as opposed to taking a car ride in my non-air conditioned car right now. So I'd like to welcome Kelly Sherman-Conroy. We are very thankful that you could come and be with us this week. And can you tell us just a little bit more about your job at Nativity and how you got there and what kind of things you're working on right now that you're really excited about?
Okay. I actually used to work I moved to Minnesota right when my son was 6 months old. And I was in Hastings, Minnesota, and decided to go to seminary. So that is I started looking for a place that was closer to Luther.
Yeah.
And Nativity chose me and I chose them. I think it's been a good fit since I've lasted this long. I think 6 years, 7 years. How old is my son? He just turned 8. However that is. Okay. Theologian, not a mathematician. And so my job has evolved because I've been in ministry for 20 years for children, youth, and family ministry. So
Wow.
Yep. And this was the first time once I had my son that I ever focused on one section of ministry. So it was just children's ministry for all this time up until about a year ago. And I became the Minister of Social Justice and Advocacy.
So that's a new title for you.
It is, yeah. And it's been really great so far.
And how did that come to be?
We have an amazing new pastor. I think he's been with us now for 2 years. And he really came with a heart, I think, and a mind of social justice in a lot of ways, and trying to be very innovative in how we do ministry. And we just saw this need in our community, and our church as a whole wanted to kind of make a deeper commitment to learning and actively learning and doing in the community. But primarily I'm focused on children and youth primarily and their families.
That's a really interesting role. It's not so often in the church that we hear children, youth, and family along with another specialization like you are currently doing in your ministry role. And so I know your church, Nativity, was specifically impacted by the public execution of Philando Castile.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit about how your congregation has been impacted by Philando Castile's death and what the response was and what it was like living through that?
Yeah, unfortunately, when it did happen, I was in Ireland on vacation. But to see it from the other side of the world in a lot of ways, right? And watching this all unfold was really interesting, just because I was so detached at first. And when I came home, our church is really kind of located in the heart of St. Anthony Village. It's not a very big place, and which is surrounded by kind of northeast Minneapolis area and kind of close to the border of St. Paul, Roseville, that kind of thing, New Brighton. And because we're also directly across from the police station and the city hall, we saw a lot of activity of marches and protests, and things like that. We are surrounded by such an amazingly diverse culture and communities of Northeast Minneapolis. I've seen that, in my opinion, our little community has really struggled with the murder of Philando Castile and the idea of social justice and what does that mean, right? And the conversations. And I feel like we are a community that has not healed over all these 4 years.
Interesting.
And Philando Castile's the anniversary of his death was just this past Monday, right? Yes. July 6th, is it? And so I think it's important. This was such an important move to have this rally in front of our church and the streets in front of the city hall to show that things have not changed, right?
Definitely. And I think we've learned over the course of these past 4 years that things haven't changed. We continue to talk about how can we have change, how can we do change, how can we have a little piece of social justice in our world, but it continues to be a talking point and less of an action point.
Yeah.
And so what kind of things are, you talked about this rally that you had this last week. Tell me more about that and how that becomes a piece of how we continue to walk towards social justice.
Yeah, I think I'm going to push back a little bit on
Yeah.
like on the acting versus the learning when it comes to social justice. I think if we look at it in a bigger spectrum of things, things aren't changing, like I said, right? And it hasn't changed. And so we've had this problem since the civil rights era, before that, and we've had people rally up, right? We've had all this happen, but nothing has really changed.
Yes.
There hasn't been a change in the systems that create the oppression. And the rally and the march itself was created from kind of a grassroots level of a 16-year-old girl that is doing some work in the community in St. Anthony Village, which is awesome. And I think that's really important, is that this rally was thought of in like about a week or so, and she pulled this all together, and the community came together to hear the voices of the Black people in our in the communities that are surrounding us that are suffering still. And so when we talk about wanting to act, right, that right therein is a good example of acting, but it's important for whatever, I think, community that is going through this trauma, this suffering, that we hear their voices. So for us, that was really important to hear their story and not have it told by somebody else.
Yes.
And we don't learn that if we don't take the time to understand ourselves, how we define ourselves, racism, white privilege, white supremacy, all that kind of stuff. If you can't be truly honest with yourself and answer those questions, and then look how you say it and how and what it really means, and then kind of dive deeper in that, you could go out and do all these different actions all you want to, but you're not going to really change anything.
Sure.
So maybe we look at it differently and change ourselves first, like really change ourselves. And like, so if like our congregation is making a commitment to doing more work, so we're looking at doing deeper by individual work within ourselves, because if we get it on our own, right, then we can go into our church, we can go into where we work, and begin to change it that way, rather than just jumping in on something maybe we don't really know as much as we thought we did.
Yeah, so you're talking a little bit about how do we move into a model of accompaniment as opposed to a model of mission and colonization?
Yeah, which is part of like, so after George Floyd was murdered, right? We had a group of rapid response people from around the Twin Cities kind of come together and say, okay, it was literally just a couple days later, I think, and they, all this stuff is going on. How do we meet the needs of the community right now? Which was big at that point, right? And it still is. And I grew up on the reservation, and I grew up with being the child that, like, my church would probably go and visit and go on a mission trip, right? And I pushed back a little bit on mission
absolutely.
trips, right? Because we are set on a model that tells us we're going to go in and change and create this change, right? Make people better because we have these skills. Well, what if we flip that and just go and be more intentional and just listen and learn? And so with that, I created an idea of interfaith chaplains. So not all Christian, coming from kind of all religious leaders or those who are kind of lead some in their communities, came together and stepped up. And we have over 100 on the list. And I started training them. And I was doing for about 2.5 weeks, 4 to 5 trainings a day. And before they went out, and we partnered with various sites around the city. And the idea was sending people out to be really intentional about how they go out in community. So knowing that their actions, even the best and kindest hearted people that go out and want to help, can still cause trauma, because you don't understand the culture of the community you're walking into, or in this case, trauma in general that people are
Right.
experiencing.
Right.
And so how you talk or how you look at somebody, or
Mhm.
even just the slightest of handing something out, how you do these things and interact could cause more problems. Because how often do we go to volunteer,
Yes.
and mostly what we usually learn is like, okay, we want 5 people to do this job,
Yeah.
and you have to give 1 for each person, right? Or you
Right.
serve this much food and that's it, and they can't have more than that. But do we ever learn about the culture of the people, what we're
Right.
truly walking into, or how to check your privilege
Yes.
at the door, right? And so
Very good point.
what would it look like if we sent people who are more intentional, and not so much going to convert people,
Yeah.
but if you were to, it would just be through your actions, right? And
Can
how
you
you
tell
do
me
it.
a little bit more about how deeply felt that is, and how that's tied into your faith? How is this new model of mission, as you think about it, or maybe mission isn't the right word, how is this model of accompaniment and intentional
I like that,
listening,
yeah.
how is that informed by your faith? And what pieces of your faith do you pull from, do you draw on in order to reassert the importance of what's going on? I know that's a
Yeah, right.
big kind of theological question, right?
Well, I think we learned, right? Christ was a disruptor,
Yeah.
and he did it in ways that really got people's attention. And I feel like because this is a new form of disruption, really, because we've been so, as a church, we have been so stuck in a certain model of doing things,
Yes.
that the idea of like going and just listening, right, is not the easiest thing for us to do, like to learn from somebody. And you see the power of it. It has taken people some time to get used to us, because of the fact that people are so used to maybe missionaries or people coming to try and to teach them about Christ, or to push their belief on other people. And I've always learned and grown up with my faith that it's all about, for me, especially as a Native person, it's through our actions and being respectful of where we are and who we are. And that's how Christ taught us. Although he was a disruptor, right? He did certain things. I feel he was also he was respectful, and he was knowledgeable, and he knew what he was walking into. And I feel like that's what's happening with this model. And I think that's why people are slowly reaching out, as they have learned more about what we're doing, is that we're not there to push anything other than we are here with you. And we don't even approach people most of the time. We are just present.
Yes.
And it's really amazing how people just come to talk. And a lot of times we're helping, of course, but in the sense of whatever it is that's going on where we are. But it's seeing people of faith in a different way in a community. I think it's humanizing people. It's not dehumanizing, and I think it's empowering for people, because I think mental health is a difficult thing to be going through, right? And
Absolutely,
all these different or the struggle to go and ask for help, right?
And to be destigmatized when we're talking about mental health specifically. There's so much stigma that goes along with needing help in our society. And what does that look like?
When I first had my son, I moved here. It's just my son and I. So I'm a single parent in the midst of ministry. And that in itself, it's not a struggle, but the struggle was the stigma put upon as a single parent in ministry. And I had to go for help.
Yes.
Right. I got to a point where, for me, it was not so much about pride as it was, I need to take care of my family. And I went somewhere and I needed help to get groceries. And it was the most dehumanizing experience I ever had. I couldn't touch the food. I couldn't pick what I wanted, or if I went to pick what I wanted, the woman, who was also polite, would say, "Are you sure you need that?" Or those kind of things. And then they double checked what I chose at the end, right? And then it was just this process that just kept breaking you down. And that's trauma.
Yes.
That doesn't go away, and it has really stuck with me. And part of that trauma is that struggle of mental health that you don't want to share with someone when you're struggling, when you're sad or you're angry or any of that. If you're, because it's there is that stigma of well, then you can't do what you're supposed to be doing, right? But if as leaders or if people, we can't take care of ourselves mentally, how do we help those we're supposed to be helping, right? If we are struggling and if we can't model what we tell people,
Yes.
even worse. So this mental health and trauma, especially with what people see right now that's happening or have been, it could be a smell, it could be their sight, it could be something they hear. There's a trigger to something that may have happened to you in the past. And we shouldn't be, I think, for me, mental health is we shouldn't be ashamed of if we struggle.
Yeah.
Right. If or whatever it is, or if something triggers that an old trauma comes back.
Definitely.
If we get rid of that stigma and talk more about that mental health and how it affects the different ways we go out and help people as well, or vice versa, of how they go for help and what that experience is like,
right,
then maybe it will change people on how they approach mental health and how to get help, or at least admit that there's something there, or I don't know. But
I definitely hear some real experiences of pain and suffering in that, and dehumanization, as you were talking about. And as I think about a little bit more about our model within our society, about how we talk about healing, and that's one of the conversations now that we're having more and more after the murder of George Floyd, is how do we respond to crisis in our society in appropriate ways. And so one of the things is, I think, one of the things that we need to look at as Christian people is how do we treat people who are in crisis with dignity. And I think that's such a keen observation on your part, to think about there are really important ways in which we respond to crisis with dignity, and in ways in which Jesus does so as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and so, all these volunteer chaplains going out, the idea is it's intentional, right? So we're creating a space, and what a lot of the people that we're going to help are the organizations or the churches that we've been at have started to realize that they're coming in knowing that there's trauma in the community. I think makes a big difference than how you walk in and how you help and how you talk to somebody, or and how you understand how you're talking to somebody. So how often like you've gone in, and I've had somebody walk in thinking I was, as I was dropping things off to donate, thinking I was there to pick something up, right? To help, but it was how she talked to me was, hi, how are you? And those little things that we do, although we're really trying to help, causes more trauma. And being intentional about how we are in community really empowers people. And I think that's important, so that we go in, we are learning more too, right? As we're a part of these communities.
Yeah, I think about how Jesus deals with the vulnerable as we look at the stories through the gospel, whether or not it's welcoming the children or eating with sinners and tax collectors, and how Jesus continually treats people with dignity. And I think that's such an important model for us as Christians to try to walk into. Now, we're obviously imperfect humans, and we're not going to get it right, but I think there's something that resonates there about the importance of how do we walk into the midst of other people's lives.
I think, and being, I don't know if neutral is the right word. I haven't been able to figure it out yet, but it's we talk about in chaplains when we go through training and stuff is like I said, we're not there to convert, but also somebody may not have the same point of view as we have. Somebody may not really see what we see, what's going on, or you see yourself and how you see it that way, and that's okay. But because if there's still someone that's struggling, if they are still having a hard time, that's why we're there. It's not about, we may not always agree, and I think sometimes that's kind of good. It keeps you on your toes, that if somebody has a good conversation with you as well, right? That says, well, I see what you're saying, but I don't see it that way. I think it's good. It's good because you learn more. They're showing you a new perspective, but we would never turn down somebody.
Definitely.
Right? If they're asking for help. I that is just not how I grew up in my faith to turn somebody away.
Yeah.
So,
Which is a really difficult thing. I've been going through here at St. John's, having people come to us continually with, can we get gas money? Can you pay for a night in a hotel so we can continue to like bridge the gap between our homelessness time and things like that? And it's really difficult because a lot of times as a pastor, I have to tell people, no, we don't have money for that.
Yeah.
And is that really what I should be doing as a person of faith? Is that really what we should be, the message we should be communicating? There's not enough room here at the inn for you, right? In a very literal sense.
I think I've always struggled with that too. I think I really don't have money, I really don't have something.
Yes.
And then you feel really bad, right? But I think how do we help people help themselves?
Yeah.
That was a lesson one of my youth got a few years ago when we did an immersion trip, which was really cool. But when we asked them, how do you help somebody, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it's pairing with an organization that is also empowering the people and teaching them.
Definitely.
So that they can learn or figure out how to become more dependent or get those resources to help them out of whatever that trouble is that they're in.
Absolutely.
Right. So not just send them anywhere, but send them somewhere that is really, really helping people move past some of these things, hopefully.
And how do you give somebody not just a Band-Aid, how do you help fix the wounds that they have, as opposed to saying, well, here's this, just take it for the time being because I know it'll get you to the next day. And there's some of those things, the direct service that we do, that is important. But how do we get really at advocacy and community organizing so that we can change the systems that keep those people there?
Yeah, I think it's looking at how we do ministry, but so even outreach ministry is changing just because even the pandemic, right? And so we really, I think, have to create a whole new narrative as to how we look at teaching the community and outreach to them as well. Because I think it's just changing. Everything has changed. So I think this is a great time to be able to do that. Yeah. It still doesn't mean that having to turn somebody down when they come to the door feels bad, but it does.
But it gives us, we have a unique opportunity right now at this time in the church and really within our wider society as a whole to get our fingers, dig our fingers into the fabric of our society and the fabric of our church and say, how are we going to change things? What has been working and what hasn't been working? Can you tell me a little bit more about your PhD studies? I know that you're working on a PhD right now. What moved you to pursue that, and what field of study are you really passionate about?
I love Luther Seminary that much. No, just kidding. I've been at Luther for a long time. So I have 2 masters from Luther, and I just kept going. And I did it because as I began to find my voice, one thing is when you go to seminary is they really make you discern about what you believe and what you know, right? And then learn how to say it. And as I began to do that, I realized that I never had that opportunity to be able to be truly me. And that I always, for a long time, thought it was just me or my family or the certain group of people I was around that carried the kind of faith or how I celebrated my relationship with God.
Yeah.
And because I came as a Native person, I've never had that separation of one day I'm going to be Native and hold on to Native traditions. The next day I'm Christian, right? I didn't grow up that way.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it only deepened my relationship with God and my spirituality. And I've always been that way. But the church has never been that way with me, right? And so it's always been that kind of either or. And so when I began to find my voice, I just wanted to be able to voice me. And then I started to learn that there were other people, even in other ethnic groups of people that are just like me, that celebrate their faith alongside and with, in a fusion of their own culture and spirituality that they come from in their ethnic backgrounds, right? And I think that's amazing, because God never created us to all be the same. And
Yes.
so I think I don't see my PhD as anything more than, in a way, as just teaching people how to be their true authentic selves. But then there's that
Interesting.
focus on trauma a little bit, and then how do you move forward? Because my goal is to not only tell my story, for me, is also to kind of create healers through that, to help. So through my work, hopefully people will begin to heal through trauma they may have found. So if it's people of color or whomever, I tend to just speak. I always speak for me, but my goal is to create healers that create healers. That it just keeps moving is like my total goal in it.
No, I think that's beautiful, and I guess I'm wondering, where in the church do you feel like you've been able to express that authentic self, and where in the church are you not allowed to express that authentic self?
You would think that it would be, anywhere that I could do that, right?
You would hope so.
You would hope so, but it doesn't always happen, right? Even about 3 years ago now, I think 2016, where are we? 17, 18, 19, 20, so 4 years almost. 2016, right, at the church-wide assembly, we passed the repudiation of doctrine of discovery, and to celebrate Native people in our church, and we made all these promises, which we're really good at in making these statements in our church.
We are.
But then I think sometimes people feel like that's it. Like, oh, we're good, and it's, yeah, we got it down, but then nothing happened. And so like a year went by, and so I created a worship service that people could use to celebrate Native people, with some stipulations of, being careful not to just take from another culture to show something, but really bringing somebody in. So bring a Native person in to help you with that worship or whatever, but really celebrate Native people and learn. For me, it's, well, you will learn how I see my spirituality and celebrate it through that worship service. And it was welcomed by a lot of people, but it also hasn't been welcomed by a lot of people. I think it's, that's where we can be complacent sometimes as a church and stick to what we believe are our traditions. And I always tell people, I said that I know my people as Native people, we have suffered through colonization, right? And genocide, cultural genocide, right?
Yes.
But so have a lot of people of European descent in this country.
Interesting.
Because how many people have you been able to, that you can connect to, that you can connect to your history? Because when the colonists came this way, they gave up their lives, they gave up their languages, right? They gave up, a lot of them gave up of their traditions to come here. And that is a form of cultural genocide in its own, right? So we've all experienced it in one way or another. It's just harder for the majority, of the European descent majority, to understand that sometimes.
Interesting.
And so I get pushback on pushing too far or being too radical in bringing in my Lakota language or any other Native language into a worship sometimes. And it's
That's
hard.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think it's important, like I said before, that we have. We're able to voice our opinions and our thoughts, but also learn to grow from it and move on. And so it's really hard when I run into a church or run into people who really strongly disagree. Or even in seminary education, it doesn't necessarily mean we're all moving forward in the same direction. And how do we help our leaders if we have some leaders that aren't moving forward?
It's a really good question. I think that's a question that we need to address in our church as a whole. And I hear you talking a little bit about ethnic specific ministries and being an adoptee and being a Korean person and owning my own story. I feel I resonate with, where can I be my true self, my authentic self in the church, and where is that line drawn for me? And so trying to figure out where that piece of me that is ethnically Korean, where does it fit within my ministry, has always been a really difficult piece of does it fit with the AAPI, the Asian American Pacific Islander Ethnic Specific Ministries? Does it fit in suburban culture where I was raised? It really is a question that I think every person of color that's a minister in the ELCA has to go through. And is it really fair that each person of color in the ELCA has to go through that soul searching and trying to fit who they are into the existing culture?
I think you're right. I think it's hard to be in a church where we're not all in the same place, and then to be a leader of color, trying to lead in a community where we still have our own struggles, and that there are times where even I have to learn to kind of shut off my ethnic side of, bits and pieces in order to really get through to people, to kind of like walk in two worlds. Is it really fair that we have to do that?
Yes.
And always hear that we are, this authentic, beloved community when you're not quite there yet. In some, we are in some, but not fully. And it is, I think, as I said earlier, God didn't make us all the same for a reason. God speaks to us in the ways that we can understand and celebrate our relationship with God, and that's important to know. And that can be in any way, and our cultures bring with us so much that we shouldn't be ashamed to just try and fully live that. But I also acknowledge there are a lot of people who are just learning about their ethnic cultures that may have been adopted or may have one way or another been disconnected.
Right.
And it's a scary thing to kind of learn both and then try and figure out how to walk in that. But when you start to learn about the history of your people or where you come from, if you can, there's just that connection that I think is really amazing. And I think it's so easy to be able to just then connect those and realize that you really weren't disconnected. You just had to reopen that door a little bit and let it come back in. And then it starts to flow. And I think I've always been connected to my culture in that way as Native, but I shut the door a long time ago in a lot of ways in order to fit in ministry.
And I think in some ways, like you were talking about, even people who are descended from European descent have shut off some of their cultural identity and forfeited that in order to fit in here. And that's an interesting thing to me, how in some ways you're expected to shut off yourself from either ethnically or culturally from your heritage in order to gain wider acceptance in our culture and in our church.
Yeah, and where in reality, really, when colonists came this direction, like I said, I think it was the trauma that tried to create a new society, so they felt better, they felt accepted, they could grow, right? But in order to do that, they shut off a lot of their true selves. And they wanted to kind of a utopia of sorts, right? And so anything that didn't fit within that mold, whether it's people themselves, right, or the Native people or whomever, they shut that off and created this, and then the society is stuck in that. But if we can just see the beauty of how we're created, and really listen, I think, with ourselves, and just try to celebrate that, or try to learn, just reconnect with where your ancestors are, and then just start with that connection, even if you can't trace it, if you know where you're kind of from or something, just start to try and reconnect. Learn, I think would go great.
I would also just like to ask, as you're thinking about creating leaders and forming young people and continuing for them to walk in faith in authentic ways, how do you see that tying into the multicultural youth leadership experience?
Oh yeah,
that's
good thing you brought that
ELCA.
up, right?
Yeah, I had to bring it up.
I know. Right? I think what Joe Davis and I are trying to do, and the rest of the team, which you're on, is show the church, stop talking about it and saying, well, we could do it this way, but really show what this true, authentic kind of leadership that's very inclusive of everybody in that celebration of culture and self, right? That we can do this. And I think we're showing that. And we're also kind of knocking the norms of what of how leadership looks.
Yes.
Right. So if you ever noticed of how we run things or how we work is it is nothing to do with kind of the patriarchal kind of way of doing things,
Yes.
right? We are very a family and it's a circle
Yes.
more than that. So we bring in and we do decisions together, right?
Yeah.
Most of the time, or things like that. We talk
Absolutely.
it out.
Well, and
right?
I've noticed even like in our little Facebook Messenger group, it's
Yeah.
very much a family there.
Yep.
And I think that's one thing that I've appreciated is how, as a leader, you've invited everybody into this process and continued to have it be a conversation, an unfolding conversation, right? And you're really leading by example in that way and walking the walk and not just talking the talk of how leadership looks in an authentic way to who we are as individuals as opposed to having one model of leadership.
Yeah. And we even have youth, right? So we've from the very beginning, we have brought youth on for a voice because you can't plan some. I'm always saying, like, if you're going to plan a celebration about whether it's about Native people or whatever you're trying to do, that you have that Native person in it. We're planning a youth event. We need youth on our teams to help us.
Oh, I absolutely agree.
Because I've learned I'm not as cool as I used to be, and like Facebook is totally for like old people. I was told.
Oh, Facebook is totally for old people, and I'm one of them now. I'm one of them now.
So like I'm trying TikTok. It's like one of those. Oh, you fall in the hole of TikTok, and what happens? Yeah, right. BTS. But it's like it's that. It's like we don't know these little things we think we do, and the youth come in, and then it's creating that family like you talked about, and it's just a whole different culture of doing things than I think what we've learned to do in the ELCA. So I'm really hoping that Mile shows the rest of the church that this is how leadership can be, and inclusive of people of color, that we don't have to leave the half of ourselves at the door in order to do something, and then shows our youth that you can come in and we empower them and we help them meet people and have experiences and celebrate themselves and learn about each other, because just because we are people of color doesn't mean that we are used to the different cultures that we are surrounded by.
Absolutely, right.
So we need to learn just as much, and so it's kind of great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it.